It is 3 o'clock. I know you have a lot of things to do this afternoon, or things that you would like to do in addition to this, so I'll go ahead and get started. What I'm going to cover today for Tech Tuesday is the introduction to Illustrator. It's a two-part Tech Tuesday session, so I'll do half this week and then there'll be another half next week if you're interested in more advanced types of tools within Illustrator. So what I wanted to do first is start off by talking about the differences between Photoshop and Illustrator. I think we have much lower numbers for the Illustrator class, and I think that's because a lot of people don't understand what it is as a program. Photoshop is far more common because it's used for editing photographs, which you have on your phones, on your computers at home, maybe scanned in from old photographs, whereas Illustrator has a little bit different function. Have either of you used Illustrator before? I didn't quite like it. Have you used Photoshop in the past? You haven't, but you have. So they're still both part of the Adobe suite, which means they have a number of tools in common, but the way that they handle images is different. Illustrator is what's called a vector-based program, and what this means is that all of the image that you see on your screen is tied into this mathematical equation. And so if you draw something in Illustrator and then blow it up 400%, 600%, you're going to have the same quality image. In Photoshop, you're working with a raster-based program, which means pixel-based. So if you've looked at photos in a photo program, Photoshop or another one, you know that if you zoom in on your computer, you start to see the pixelation of the image. And so that's one of the main differences. And so when you're choosing to use either Photoshop or Illustrator for your project, if you're working with photographs, there's not much you can do except work in, if you're editing a photograph in Photoshop, because you will have, the image already complete. But if you're starting from scratch, in particular making a logo, making some sort of design that needs to be applied to different uses. So for example, I brought in the CC logo, both in Photoshop and Illustrator, to show you the differences. The logo, for example, made in Illustrator can be designed in this program and then shrunk down to a business card size or blown up to a banner for campus. So that's one of the advantages of working in this vector-based program. So if you have something that needs to work on number of scales, or you don't know how large or how small the final product is going to be, working in Illustrator gives you a lot more flexibility with your original material. And you'll see in Illustrator that I brought in just the CC logo, one of the downloads from the website, was designed in Illustrator. It is a vector-based file, and you can see if I zoom in, we're at 7,400% right now, that there's still very crisp edges on this image. And again, that gives you that flexibility to change the size of your image over time depending on the output. If I go back to Photoshop, I have the same image. I actually took the Illustrator file and I just saved it as a JPEG of a basic 300 pixel file, which is a standard print resolution. If I start zooming in on the same pattern, you can already see this is at 400%, the pixelation around the edges. So this is a really clear demonstration of the difference between these raster files, these pixel-based files, versus Illustrator files, which are vector-based. And so, again, that's sort of a basic introduction to the differences between the two programs. If you have any more questions about that, I'll be happy to elaborate on that at the end. So for those of you who just came in, I wanted to let you know that I typically have a handout for these Tech Tuesdays, and I will mail it to you afterward. I left them on my desk across the street. But I am Megan Rubenstein. I'm the Curator of Visual Resources in the Art Department. So you can contact me, finding me through online, or there's also a sign-in sheet on the front table, so when you leave, if you want to leave your email address, I'll contact you. So for an introduction to Illustrator, I wanted to give you some idea of how to start your own file, to understand the terminology in Illustrator, so that you have some of the basic tools to work with as you move forward. Illustrator is available in a number of the computer labs on campus, in Armstrong, in the Keck Lab, in the Cat Lab, in Tut Library, as well as in the 2 Cornerstone labs in the Cornerstone Arts Building. So these are all places that if you want to play with Illustrator on your own, you can go over there and try them out. So in Illustrator, I already have the program opened, so we can match it up to the size of the screen. But we are using Illustrator CC, which is the Creative Cloud version. It's the newest version of Illustrator. If you have an older version on your own computer, such as CS6 or CS5, most of these steps will be the same. So when you're in Illustrator, I mentioned that as a vector-based program, it works on this mathematical system. And so rather than working with pixels, you're working with something called a path. And I have some examples up here on the screen. And if you see, you can't probably read this, but if I hover on this line, it is a path. And a path is the outline of an object or the line itself. The path doesn't actually have to have a color. And if you see, I've actually got another path, this top right-hand corner, that if you hover over it with the cursor, you can see it appear. The path is just that line. And so what you do to get the line to be visible is add a stroke or a fill. And the path itself, this second path, has a stroke. You can see at the top of your menu, you'll have these options to adjust the color and the weight of the stroke. I have a couple examples too that also show you that there are ways to make your path look a little bit more illustrated. Otherwise you have a very clean line like you saw with the CC logo. But there are a number of basically filters you can apply to your line to give them a little bit different look. So these paths have just adjusted weights. Like I said, if you decide to change the color, that is in this top menu bar. The left menu bar also will have a changing screen for your stroke. The other option you have to change is the fill of your path. If you have an open path, which is one that doesn't have the two ends touching, you can still add a fill. It will just add it in between the lines. It's a little bit awkward, but you can see here. It'll try to fill in what it can between the 2 points on your path. If you have a shape too, you can also adjust the fill and the stroke. So for example, you can change the stroke color, you can change the fill color. What's nice about Illustrator is that if you're unsure of the final product, if you're making a very graphic image, something that relies on these sharp colors and contrast of line, you can continue to play with the color and the line and the weight for as long as you have the file. You don't have to worry about changes in Photoshop, for example, being permanent. Like if you were in the Photoshop Tech Tuesday, so if you change the contrast, you change the color makeup of your photo and you save it, that's it. Like it saves it. But in Illustrator, you continue to go back and change the stroke and the anything that's related to this path, your series of lines. And you can make very complex shapes as well. And this is something that I'll talk a little bit more about next week. So what I wanted to do then is just give you an example just to show you how you can create these images in Illustrator now that you've seen what the paths look like when they have various strokes and fills. So when you're in Illustrator, you can open a new document as if you're in Word or another program that you're more familiar with. It's just under File, Open, and it brings up this new document screen. You can name it anything you want. You can leave it blank and rename it later in your computer. You adjust how many artboards you're working with, and what I wanted to let you know about the term artboard, which will be on the handout that you receive, is that you're not really just working with a page in Illustrator. The artboard is the entire gray space around your page as well. And so what this does is it gives you a working space. I'll cancel this. You can actually move some of your objects outside of your printable area, which is the white space. If you're not sure if you need them, or you've designed a couple versions of a logo, for example, maybe you're meeting with someone and you want to try out different logos to find out a final approval. So you can use this artboard space, this grayed out space, to move objects away from your main image and then come back for them later. They won't print, they won't disappear when you close your file, they'll be saved in what's basically your scrapboard. So that's something else you can use. So that's why when you make a new file, it considers it to be an artboard. And if you want, you can have multiple white boards with space around them as well. So I'm just going to make one. You can choose your size, just use a custom letter size. If you're working in the metric scale or the standard, you can choose what to use. I'll use inches just because it's fairly standard, 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. You can change your orientation as well if you prefer to start off with vertical or horizontal, and your bleed margins. There's a number of other options that you have if you are working for production. So if someone is asking for something with a very specific color space, CMYK versus RGB, basically the difference between a printer or a screen resolution or a certain resolution, these are all items that you can change. Yes?
What are bleed margins?
The bleed margin is if you are printing a poster, for example, and let's say that you want 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper like this, but you want your image to go all the way to the edge. Most printers have about an 1/8 variation in the cutting process if it's being cut from a larger sheet. So if you set up a bleed margin, it'll give you, let's say, 1/8 of an inch border on your artboard, so you know to stretch your image to that edge. So when it's printed, then it'll have that bleed just in case your paper shifts or the printer is not as accurate as you expected. Any other questions so far? So when you are working in your new document, there's a number of ways to start. So it does help to be working on something that is very graphic, and you saw the limitations of using paths or basically strokes and shapes in order to make your object. There are a number of ways to put together some very complex images in Illustrator. So I wanted to give you some idea of how that works. You might have noticed when I was in the previous screen, which you can go back to, I was using a pointer at the top left. If you haven't used Photoshop before, these are what are called the selection tool and the direct selection tool. The differences between the tool, the main difference I should say, is that the selection tool will select your entire path or object. So you see if I have this black arrow, it's just selecting the entire object. You can see here it's just a filter applied. If you're using the direct selection tool, you can select individual points on your path. And so you notice when we click on these, each of the paths, it's a little bit harder to see on this scale, has individual points that create the shape. If you use the direct selection tool, you can just move part of your shape. Whereas I have my selection tool on, it moves the entire shape at once. So that's something just to be aware of when you're working in Illustrator on your own, that you have those two options. So I want to start off with the shape because it's one of the more straightforward tools in Illustrator, especially if you're starting with something that's very regular and using rectangles, squares, circles. They're all in this left-hand menu. Typically when you first open Illustrator, the rectangle tool will be what you see. But if you click and hold, there's actually a group of stacked tools underneath the rectangle. So you can select any one of these. Use the polygon. And once you have your tool selected, if you click and drag, you'll get your shape. So this will create a path based on the shape itself. You can make as many as you'd like. If you want your shape to be a particular size, like if you're a rectangle, you can just click once on the backdrop and you can type in the size that you'd like and click OK. I'm using my selection tool to move it on the screen. And it will make your shape using whichever settings you have for the stroke and for the fill. So the standard will be the black stroke and a white fill. It looks like it's actually transparent, but it's not. This transparent is, oh, that got cut off. Hold on. See if I can move this on. I'll use it down here. The transparent is actually this white box with a red line through it. So that'll give you the actual transparency and just the shape outline. You also, any of these shape tools that you're using, if you wanted to put another square, for example, when I click and drag, I have the option of any rectangle. But if you hold down the Shift key, you can make it a perfect square. So rather than just typing in the key, the Shift key will work very often to constrict your proportions on any tool that you use. So with the shape tools, as I said, you can change the interior. You don't actually have to have a stroke. The path will still exist for the shape even if you turn off the stroke. So you can have just the fill and not the extra line. And you can see you have a very clean pink square here without the line on it. And again, you can change this at any time while you're working. So in addition to the shape tool, you have the option to make your own lines using a couple of different tools. If you are looking for a straight line, there's something called the line segment tool. And any of these tools on the left-hand toolbar, if you just hover your mouse over top of them, you'll see what the name of the tool is. So here we have, for example, the line segment tool. So I click on it once, and I can click and drag, just like with the shape tool, to create a line. Now, I don't have any stroke selected at this point. You can see both my stroke and my fill are transparent. So when I click away, it disappears. You have to kind of just search for it again if you don't have one selected. The line tool will stay straight, but it will go at any angle unless you're holding down the shift. If you're holding down shift, you have you can see it's sticking to 45-degree angles, or actually even smaller. There you go. So 45, 90, and so forth all the way around. So if you're working on something too that you want spokes for a wheel, for example, or something to have very regular intervals, you can also use your shift button to work on that. For more freeform lines, we'll zoom out a little bit more. Okay. I'll just use the space at the bottom. For more freeform lines, you have a couple of options. One of the ones that you'll have on your handout is the pen tool. The pen tool looks like a quill pen tip, and if you hover over it, you'll see it's called just the pen tool. And what this allows you to do is actually draw with the points on your path. So before, we would draw a line or a shape, and the points on the path would just appear. In this case, you'll see if I click, I get an anchor point. Click again, another one. So you can click and draw your own line in this way. The other thing, so I just hit return to end that line, is the pen tool allows you to click and drag to create curved lines. So each of these points, and you saw when I used the direct selection tool, if you click on one of the points, each one has a pair of handles that come off of it, and these allow you to adjust the angle of your line. So if I click and drag, I'm getting very smooth lines with the pen tool. And once I have those, again, you can use your direct selection tool, select one of the lines, and then you can click and drag these handles. So anytime you need to change the angle of a line, you can change the length of them and the angle of them in order to find a curve that you desire. This is one of those tools that takes a little bit of practice to get used to. It will seem frustrating at first when you start clicking and points keep appearing and you're getting straight lines and you're getting right angled lines and you're trying to find the handles, but once you learn how to use this tool, it gives you quite a bit of control over the curve that sometimes freehand drawing won't give you, because it gives you a very smooth line. Very recent, I think an addition in the Creative Cloud version of Adobe Illustrator is what's called the curvature tool, and the icon is a pin that has a small curved line coming out of it, and what this does is it draws lines like the pin tool with the points, with the handles, but it only draws curves. So, hold on, I'm still attached to this one. So you also click and drag. Well, you don't have to click. So I clicked and I let go. You can see it's giving me a trajectory of the line. I let go and then click it again. So it's an even quicker way to draw curves without having to worry about pulling the correct angle out. Sometimes getting them to let go can be frustrating. You can always click back to one of your selection tools, and you can see it defines the entire shape. So I could change this shape with the entire selection tool, or go back in with the direct selection tool and change the lines. Are there any questions about the drawing tools? So depending on your purpose, you might choose one that you like and use it pretty regularly, and only use the others in circumstances where it necessitates it. I tend to favor the brush tool, which is another way to draw lines, and this is because it's the closest thing to freehand drawing that you'll find in Illustrator. Most of these other examples I've shown you have been very technical, drawing straight lines, working with angles, trying to adjust the curve based on the points. But when you're using the brush tool, you have much more freedom over what you're drawing. If you're using a mouse, you can just use the mouse to draw. I've brought in the Wacom tablet before, but I have this here today if anybody wants to try it. If you're using one of the drawing tablets that we have in the Cornerstone Labs, for example, you can use a pen and draw. So I'll just select the brush tool. It's in this left-hand toolbar as well. It looks like a paintbrush. The same options come at the top. You can adjust your stroke weight, you can adjust the color, you can adjust the shape of the brush. You have a little bit of control over that. And then you basically just click and draw. So you can see how fluid the lines are by comparison. You know, if you wanted a curved line, you can just draw it, and the points will appear automatically. So if I select this, you can see each of these points. It's not super easy to see on this red. Well, there are points in that line that you can adjust as well. So it still reads the same as the other Illustrator files, the other Illustrator lines that you're making, but you have more control over the original line rather than having to go back in and adjust it to meet. There's also a pencil tool which functions a lot like the paintbrush tool. It is buried under this new tool called the shaper tool. So there is also a pencil tool which will allow you the same control over the line. The difference with the pencil tool, the difference between that and the paintbrush, is that it tends to add these points based on the speed that you're drawing. So for example, if I'm very slowly drawing, it'll pick up every nuance of the curve, whereas the paintbrush tool tends to just pick up what's needed to create the curves that you've made. So there's a little bit more sensitivity in that. If you decide you don't like your line, if you have the entire one selected, you can just hit delete to get rid of it. Each of these paths will independently be selectable, so if I decide to go back and get rid of one of my first polygons, I can just select it and hit delete just with the cursor. If you're working with this direct selection tool, you'll find that it only deletes one point. So that's one way to fragment your line. You decide you don't want this end of the curve, you can go through with your direct selection tool, pick a point, and hit delete. And because it's a path, it will delete anything attached to that point. There is also an eraser tool. It looks like a little box. It's like the erasers you had in school on the chalkboard. If you have your object selected, you do have to have it selected. You can go through and also delete parts of the line. I have a strange tool on here. But you can go through and delete in between points in this way, and it'll create new points at the end of where you erased. So you do have that option as well. It's not the same as, erasing in Photoshop where you just delete everything that you come across. It still does work on this path system. Are there any questions about the lines or the shapes? So there's a lot you can do once you get into the program and start creating. The last thing I wanted to show you in the few minutes that we have is that you can also use type and text tools in Illustrator as well. I'm actually going to make a new document since this one's a little bit of a mess. The advantage to this, remember, is if you're using Illustrator for a document, and when individuals are making posters, sometimes it's nice to use Illustrator instead of Photoshop for the layout because you can adjust the size. Text seems to be one of the first things that gets pixelated when you start blowing up a document. So if you've made a paper, like an 8.5 by 11 sheet poster, and you decide you want it to be 11 by 17, when you blow it up, the text starts to pixelate. But you can use the text in Photoshop, or in Illustrator, as you would in Photoshop if you've used it before. There's something called the type tool. It's this T located in the left-hand menu. If you just click on your document, you can start typing. It'll show up. It works like your path in that you can resize it. Again, it's all vector-based, so you can do a lot with your text. You can use this arrow to rotate it, continue to resize it. There are a couple other things you can do. If you hold down the type tool, there are a number of stacked tools. You can type vertically in this way, so you can do a lot with the text layout, which you can also then modify. If you want to type only within one of your objects, you can do that. I don't have any up now, but if you select an area type tool, if you want to type within a particular space, you can select your object, this box I just made, click on the path, and you can type within this box. And no matter how long you type, I guess I should get to the end here, it will continue to wrap your text within the shape. And this works on all types of shapes. You could use a star tool and type within the star. You can use the compound shape tool and make something that's really complicated and type within it. You can also type on the path itself, which is one of the most fun things you can do in Illustrator, in my opinion. You can draw any type of line that you want. I'm going to leave the stroke selected, so you see I have a black stroke on this line. I'm going to select my path, just this black line, and then in my type tool, type on a path. See, if I get near my path, you get this little squiggly line underneath. I don't know why I'm worried about spelling. Just an example. Okay, but I want to show you that you can type on the entire length of the path. And when you're done, you can make sure that there's no stroke and there's no fill. And you'll just have your text on this path. So even though the path itself is invisible, the text is responding to that path. And because it's a path, you can continue to do everything else you know how to already do in Illustrator by rotating it. You can go back with your direct selection tool and you can change the angle. And then if you get really into it, you can go back to your type tool and you can adjust the kerning and you can adjust the leading. And so there are a number of options with working with text in Illustrator too, that if you just are working with text, I think concrete poetry would be a lot of fun to work on in Illustrator, for example. Then this is a good program for that as well. And you can make it a banner or a billboard or something small like a note card. That's all I have for you on the introduction to Illustrator, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask me, or you can come up and use the computer for a minute or two if you'd like to just try it out, the drawing tablet or the program. But thanks for coming. And there's a second section next Tech Tuesday on working with more of the tools within Illustrator. So if you have a chance and want to go to both of them, hit one of the labs and try out Illustrator on your own before then, get a sense. And I'll email you the PDF of the document for this session if you just sign up on the front. All right. Thanks.